Right. This session is dedicated to honor Dr. Elaine Arnold. And we approach the session by doing firstly a video, which will do an introduction. And then that video will contain a bio and an interview with Dr. Arnold, following which Dr. Arnold will address us. Okay, so we now will turn to the video.
Good day, colleagues. My pleasant task is to introduce Dr. Elaine Arnold, to whom this plenary session is dedicated. Dr. Elaine Arnold trained as a teacher in Trinidad and Tobago at the Government Teachers Training College. After teaching for several years at primary schools, including the one within the compound of St. Mary's Children's Home, she changed career to social work and specialized in child guidance. Her academic and professional background includes a diploma in social welfare from Swansea University, a diploma in psychiatric social work from Manchester University, an MPhil from Sussex University, and a PhD from University College London. Dr. Arnold was also trained in intercultural counselling and brief therapy at the NAFCIAT Intercultural Therapy Centre, London. She also completed training in child observation at the well-known Tavistock Clinic in London also. In terms of her research, she conducted research and published books and articles on the effects of separation, broken attachments, and loss on children and families of Western origin through immigration from the West Indies to the UK. She was the researcher in the 3-year project entitled New Black Families, implemented by a district in London, Borough of Lambeth, and the Independent Adoption Society. The professional social worker reflects a unique transatlantic diversity that included both Trinidad and Tobago as well as the UK. In Trinidad and Tobago, she worked as a psychiatric social worker at the St. Anne's Psychiatric Hospital and was later seconded to the Ministry of Health as the first coordinator of the National Community Mental Health Program. During her employment as a childcare officer, she worked in the hills of Laventille, where she helped to establish the government's preschool program. She was an active member of several NGOs, including District Commissioner of the Girl Guides Association, responsibility for training, National Council of Voluntary Associations for Childcare. In fact, in 1973, she was the recipient of a National Award for Voluntary Social Work, and she received the Hummingbird Medal Gold awarded by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. She was attracted to the work of Serval, an NGO that intuitively embodied the principles of acceptance and client self-determination in doing their community interventions. She worked with Dr. L.F.E. Lewis, consultant psychiatrist, and brother of the late Sir Arthur Lewis, Nobel laureate in economics. Together with Dr. Lewis, they pioneered the delivery of services to emotionally disturbed children and adolescents. She was an active member of the Trinidad and Tobago Association for Mental Health, under whose auspices she regularly promoted public education and awareness of mental health issues. Migrating to the UK, she conducted an evaluation of the Trinidad and Tobago National Community Mental Health Program and presented her report to the Ministry of Health. In the UK, she worked in child guidance at Brighton's Children's Hospital, Brighton, England. Dr. Arnold was a trainer at the Borough of Wandsworth, where she was head of the social work student unit. She also supervised nursery school workers and facilitated training in anti-racism for personnel throughout the various departments of the borough. Dr. Arnold taught on the MSc Social Work course at Goldsmiths College, the MSc Social Work course at Sussex University. She also taught on the MSc course in Intercultural Therapy at the University College London in conjunction with the NAFCIAT Intercultural Therapy Centre, where she was also Director of Training at this Intercultural Therapy Centre and taught courses dealing with diversity as external examiner for the MSc course at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, the MSc Intercultural Therapy course, University College London, and the postgraduate course in counseling at Goldsmith College, London. Dr. Arnold is the founder and continues to hold the position of Honorary Director of Supporting Relationships and Families, awareness of traumatic effects of people who experience separation and loss in early childhood through immigration and other circumstances in their lives, such as adoption, foster care, institutional care, boarding school, and bereavement. We will now transition to a pre-recorded interview with Dr. Arnold, after which Dr. Arnold will be invited to address the conference.
Today, I have the pleasure to talk with Dr. Elaine Arnold, psychiatric social worker emerita, who has worked in the Caribbean and in the transatlantic space of the UK and Europe with Afro-Caribbean families. Joining me this morning in conversation are two distinguished child development specialists in the Caribbean, Dr. Jacqueline Sharp, consultant child psychiatrist, and Ms. Joan Bishop, retired medical social worker and executive director of an NGO, Creative Parenting for the New Era. So welcome, Elaine. Welcome, Elaine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Perhaps we can get straight into it by asking you, what motivated you to choose psychiatric social work as a career?
What motivated me? Well, I began my working life as a teacher, first in Barbados and then in Trinidad. And I was sent to school in La Brea, where I thought it was the end of the world. And so it was a church school. We were church schools then. And the Anglican Church, I asked for to be moved and transferred to a school nearer Port of Spain. The first vacancy was at the Tacarigua Orphanage. It's now known as the Children's Home, because only about 25% of the children there were real orphans. And it was considered that the name was inappropriate, so they changed it to Children's Home. The nursery was situated right at the gate of the institution. And as you entered the grounds, you could hear children crying because staff was very short and they worked on shifts, and very often they were handing over and children were left unattended. So one morning I went in and I said to the manager, "Can I stay with these children until my school begins, till the main school, which was at the end of the of the driveway, began at 9. So I was early." And she said, "Oh, I'd be so happy because we are short staffed." And the children just came running, wanting to be held, holding up their arms, holding on to my legs, to whatever part they could get of me. And I said, "Oh my goodness, these children need some social contact. They want to be, they are missing something." So then I asked permission, and every morning I was allowed to stay there until after the assembly, when my class would be ready for me. And that was how it all began. Now, I saw in the press that the United Nations offering a scholarship to Swansea University. And I decided I would apply. And it seemed nobody else in the teaching profession or in Trinidad was interested. So I got the scholarship. I suppose you would call it getting the scholarship by default. But I got the scholarship and came to Swansea, and the program consisted of economics, studies, attachment, and so I was successful and went back to Trinidad and told them, the Ministry of Education, what I had learned. And they said, oh, well, you do what you like with that. We have no complaints about your teaching, so do what you want. So Mary Murray, nobody remember her name.
Yes, the first PSW.
Yes. She was the wife of Eric Murray, who was then ambassador Trinidad's ambassador to the UK. And he was stationed in Trinidad as ambassador. And she came. So at first, she was not allowed to work because she was the wife of an ambassador. So she volunteered to work at St. Anne's Hospital. And as was the practice there, given their 3-month vacation leave to go back to England, came up to the children's home and asked if I would be willing to act. So of course, I said yes. And so I became interested.
Can you share some of your experience regarding your early pioneering work and your collaboration with Dr. L.F.E. Lewis, psychiatrist and brother of Sir Arthur Lewis, the Nobel laureate?
Yes, of course. At the time, Dr. Lewis, he was in charge of psychiatry at St. Anne's Hospital. And because we had to produce the social histories for the patient before the psychiatrist saw the patient, to visit the family, look at the environment, from the plan for their discharge, families even before they were treated. He firmly believed that you plan for discharge because very often many of the patients would not be kept long in hospital. And so I was attached to him to provide these histories. And on the day when he saw the patient, I was there with him so that he could ask questions or the patient could ask me questions. And we worked together, like wrote all the at St. Anne's, and also in outpatient clinics at the hospital. That was where I met May Sherry and medical social workers and Joan I said, oh, Joan, I'm sure you would make a very good.
That was much later.
Yeah.
Came back in 63.
Yes.
Yes, Elaine, I was about to ask, what kind of presenting problems did you encounter with children and families in the era of the 60s and 70s?
Mainly, the presenting problems were that parents were not, did not understand child development really. They would expect them to behave in ways that were totally inappropriate for their ages. I vividly remember a mother coming to the outpatient clinic one with a child dressed in off-shoulder dress, shoes about 2.5 inches tall. The child was tottering into the room. And the mother telling me, I bring this child here because I don't think her head is, she wouldn't hear what I say. She wouldn't do anything I say. I said, but how do you expect her to behave differently when you dress her like an adult? So I said to her, go home, change her proper clothes on her proper shoes, and come back. I'll wait for you. I'll wait here at the clinic, even if the doctor is gone. And then I'll make an appointment for you for him to see her next week. So she looked at me in amazement, as though I was off my head, you know. And I said, go along quick. And she said, okay, I just live road by the dry river. I'll go and I'll. So she went and she came back. And I sat with her and I talked to her and I asked her exactly what the child did. And she said, well, she liked to do things that grown-up people do. Like what? Like pour her tea and all the rest of it. So I expect that children imitation, and that at nursery school, when she was playing at serving tea, she would be pouring tea out of the teapot. So it was not that she was doing anything that she thought was wrong and so on. And so that was one of the main presenting problems. The other problem was that they didn't really speak with children. You know, they spoke at them and they gave them commands, do this, do that. They never explained. And when children were 4.5 years old, and they began asking why and what and this, they would hit them and say, you know, I am your mother. You do what I say. Because corporal punishment was still very much used by parents and in schools, fortunately to say, by children who didn't obey. Do you want me to go on over?
I think fundamentally that some things have changed and some things really remain the same. You know, we're still struggling with corporal punishment. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the central work that you continue to do. After you left Trinidad and went to England, it seems to me that that your work with the Caribbean diaspora really meant that you started to explore issues, particularly of separation of and loss. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What were the things that made this become a central part of your work?
Yes. When I decided that I would leave Trinidad and further my studies, I read quite a lot of Dr. John Bowlby's work, and he, as you know, talked about separation and loss. And he thought that, and he said, children, just as parents needed their children, children also needed their parents, especially their mothers, with whom they the earliest years of their lives in their company. And so it's not right that children would be separated from their mothers for any length of time. Not that he was saying that mothers had to be there 24 hours a day, but he was saying that there should be time to be with their children. And we know that that was very hard because very often, or most of the time, mothers work because their incomes were quite low, and sometimes fathers were out of work or fathers didn't give their assistance to the family. Sometimes, going back, times I used to go on payday when fathers got their wage and stand there and physically say, come, give me what you're giving me. What you're going to give the family. If you're going to give them 2 shillings, 5 shillings, or so, give it to me, and I will give it to the family and give you a receipt. So that sort of shamed them or made them realize how important their contribution was to provide the child with good food, good clothes, and pay the rent and all this. And eventually, some of them continued, and I then could stop going to their workplace because sometimes their workmates who had no children would laugh and say, yeah, look, the lady coming for the children's money, you know, and some of them would try to run and hide and that sort of thing. It seems funny after, but at the time, it was really serious to get that money to get to the children. So, yes, so in England, I studied very much separation and about separation and loss of Caribbean children who, when parents left the Caribbean, had left their children with grandmothers and other members of the family, extended family, sometimes not even family. It would be godmothers or good friends, anyone who was able to look after the child physically. Does that answer the question?
Yes. But one of the things that it seems to me that you did work on was the reunion of these same children who'd been left behind when they finally had an opportunity to get to Britain, meet their family, sometimes their mothers, sometimes their mother's new partner, who was not their father but their stepfathers.
Yes.
And the difficulties that arrive sometimes with those reunions. What were some of the central issues around reunion that emerged?
Yes, that was a very, very intense piece of work, because the children had become closely attached to the surrogate parent that left in the Caribbean, whether it was grandmother or it was aunt, or sometimes it was maternal grandmothers, sometimes paternal, whoever it was, they were attached to that person. And the mothers in the UK, they didn't quite understand that concept. They felt that it was their child and the child should love them and not the grandmothers. And they had worked very, very hard when they got to England to supply all the physical needs that they thought the child had or should be met. I'm sure that you must have heard something about these barrel children, as they were called. Barrel
Yes.
used to send, pardon?
No, it's a very popular expression, barrel children. Yes.
Yes, because they sent all the goods, clothes, food, playthings, dolls. Sometimes the clothes were not appropriate because they would send nice woolen skirts, particularly, which was so hot in the Caribbean. But they saw how nicely these children looked in these skirts, and they wanted their child to look like these children here, and they would send these clothes. But sometimes the money would run out, and the children would be left only with the empty barrel. At one time, a young woman did an interview with me about these barrel children, and she had an example of a child holding on to the barrel, which was the only thing that she had to associate her mother with. And so I was able to try to tell the parents what was going on and happening with these children, and to try to communicate with them. Well, telephones were not as popular as they are now, so it was difficult to phone and so I encouraged them to write letters and so on. And some of them did. But what happened, because England was recovering from rebuilding the country, the Second World War, they wanted people to work. And so they had recruited English women from the indigenous population to go and work in the military. They were driving trucks and lorries and things, and they built nurseries for the children of these parents. But these nurseries were built out of the main area, out of London, in the counties where it was not very much, where there was hardly any bombing. So when the parents, the Caribbean parents, thought that, that they wanted help, not thought, they knew they wanted help with their children, and they went to social services, they sent these children to the nurseries. And the nurseries were situated where there was hardly people at all. And the children then became attached and to the carers, and the carers became attached to the children, as you would expect. And when the parents tried to visit, of course, the children, not seeing any black faces before, they were scared, and they would run away from the parents and hide behind the carers. And the carers said to the parents, why do you come to visit there? You just disturb them, and when you go, we have to comfort them, so don't come. Don't come. And many of the parents, believing that what the white carers told them was true and better, they stopped visiting. Some decided they would, but some decided they would leave work and take them home and then send for those older children whom they had left in the Caribbean. So you get the picture.
Yeah.
Yes. So these children then came, sent for the children. And when these children arrived, not knowing the parents, and the parents not knowing them, they were then expected to look after these young children. So it was really a sad time for the whole families.
That many of the women who you saw in your work suffered from mental illness at that time.
Yes. Yes. Many of the parents were diagnosed as mentally ill, whether they were mentally ill or not. They were diagnosed as being schizophrenic.
Okay.
They weren't diagnosed, nobody seemed to have thought about them being depressed, or they thought that the people, it was said in some instances that Black people were so jolly and happy that they didn't get depressed.
Oh.
They did. So when children were referred to child guidance, it was when the mothers were depressed and went to the school and weren't able to collaborate and take in anything the teachers were telling them, they were then, only then were they sent for treatment. And there was one child psychiatrist, Dr. Prince, who he was the first one to try to look at the parents and get the school to understand how the parents' reaction and the children, how they were intertwining and causing the problem. And then these parents were referred to groups called nurture groups, which would get the parents to meet and talk about how they were missing their own mothers and how it was difficult to discipline the children because they didn't know what to do with them.
Elaine,
Besides corporal punishment.
and on that note, as we're about to wrap up, what advice or messages would you direct to researchers, planners, policymakers, and social workers based on your experience?
Well, from my experience, I would say that first of all, they need to look at their own attachment experiences, how they feel about it. That's number one, and that's very, very important, because very often people say, well, didn't bother me, I don't see why it should bother you, and things like that. And we don't want people saying that. And secondly, just ignore that. Secondly, they must provide enough personnel to be able to work closely with families. And then they must train them, have them trained properly, because there's no point sending social workers to work with people when there are not enough to go around. I think those three main things would help immensely. I may think of others.
You mentioned that the young men were having some special problems and they ended up in the prison system.
Yes. The young men didn't feel as though they should be included in work with young children. Very often they will say that was women's business. When the child was big enough, they would talk with them and they would play with them. I remember I used to do a program, a TV program, and one day the program was based on fathers and children, and one of the camera crew, at the end of the program, he said, "What do you want? You want the child to have two mothers?" I said, "No, child must have a mother and a father. And each one has a specific duty to perform to the child, and they must work in collaboration with each other, not when the mother say one thing, you say something else, and so on." And he liked what I said, and he said, "Okay, I will, when I go home, I'll see what I can what I can do." I always wonder what happened to that family.
But on that note, let me thank you for
for consenting to this interview with us, and it's really been a pleasure. And on behalf of Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, we look forward to your presentation at the conference sometime between the 19th and the 21st. So we thank you sincerely. It's been a pleasure. Okay, we now invite Dr. Arnold to do her presentation.
Thank you, Lionel. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And not only a pleasure, but a great honor to talk to you on this second day of this very important conference. You have heard quite a lot from very eminent and prominent speakers who have had quite useful and intriguing presentations. I've learned quite a lot, and I hope that you will be able to get something from the things that I may say to you. I'm sure that there is not much new to many of you, but probably we will look at it from a different perspective. I begin by saying that there are many sociologists and novelists who have written about the origins of the Caribbean family. During the 1950s, social workers began to look at the adverse effects of maternal deprivation on the young child. While much attention has been given to the ill effects which the child may suffer if his need for his mother is not adequately met, very little attention has been given to the mother. And for one reason or another, was unable to experience that sense of belonging to her child. As we know, in our societies, the importance of the mother has been greatly idealized. Her praises and her worth have been extolled in poetry and song, and many are the tales told of the devotion to their children and the sacrifices made for them. Many of us will remember when we celebrated, I don't know whether it's done now, Mothering Sunday. And all the poetry and all the praises would be showered on mother. But nevertheless, alongside the acceptance of the importance to the child of his natural mother, the practice of engaging the services of mother substitutes, grandmothers, nannies, foster mothers is widespread. Dr. John Bowlby, of whom I spoke in my interview earlier, he was aware that a woman who was not biologically related to an infant was able to function in the role of the mother to the child and give the child that continuous love and affection so necessary for emotional growth. But in spite of this, the mystical importance attached to mother, if she had not had the opportunity to care for and experience the need of her child in its early years, very often she attempted to make good the loss at a later stage of the child's life. And this can be disastrous, not only for the child, but for herself. There's a growing body of evidence to illustrate that reunions between mother and children are not always, are not always satisfactory, especially if they're for long periods. The now bias of a child to attach himself to a figure, and this usually during the first year of life is not always understood by the lay person. This lack of understanding of attachment behavior and given rise to considerable pain and suffering among some mothers from the Caribbean now living in Britain. Immigrating to this country, they had left their young children in the care of grandmothers, as we have said before. At the end of several years, the mothers made every effort to have the children join them and looked forward to reunion with them immediately they arrived. They did not know the children, nor the children didn't know them, and so they were virtual strangers to each other. In some instances, the children outright rejected them. But in recent years in Britain, there has been an increasing desire among social workers, teachers, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists to understand the problems with which West Indian families struggle, and more especially to discover what may be some of the factors contributing towards the poor relationships between some of the parents and their children reunited after long years of separation. The separation, the reactions of the children when they arrive in just a strange country of Britain, in most strange situations, mothers, when they were expected to address as mother. These are well demonstrated. The child would arrive and mother would expect them to call them mother when back in the Caribbean, they've been calling those who took care of them mother. And there's an example, which I quote. She was Jamaican. She recounted that her parents left her when she was only a few months old. And when she arrived in England, she mistook an older sister for her mother. And the mother became very angry indeed. And in a survey of 258 children in a comprehensive school, as they were then called, 149 had been separated from their parents with a length of separation which ranged from 1 year to 13 years, with the average length of 5 years. When reunions between mothers and children proved unsatisfactory for both the child and the mother, there was a tendency for social workers and teachers to champion the cause of the children. The majority of studies of separation and reunion have been child-centered, but a few persons have drawn attention to the plight of the parents, especially the mothers, who they themselves, the mothers, struggling with unsatisfactory unions. What they were unable to really take care for the children. The expectation of relatives and friends were that biological mothers would instinctively love the children, even though they had not been able to interact and become attached to them in the early years. Therefore, many mothers trying to fulfill these expectations accepted the strange children whom they did not know, but found it extremely difficult to relate. So it was then no wonder that, burdened with guilt at having left the children behind when they migrated, and bewildered by feelings of resentment or positive dislike for the child, mothers were found to be disturbed and unhappy. When I began to research among the families, my aim was to really get to the bottom of the feelings of mothers about their relationships with their children, to discover how they reacted to the separation and the reunion experience. I was interested in examining the personalities of the mother and to learn how they cope with stress, how they reacted to loss, to pain, and to guilt. If it were unusual for reunited mothers and children to experience unsatisfactory relationships, what were the contributing factors? And could anything be done to minimize and change of these factors being the chances of these factors being malignant? Being a social worker, I was naturally interested to discover what was the incidence of mental disorder among the mothers, and whether these mothers possessed any personality traits to an excessive degree which influenced their relationships in general and to their separated, reunited children in particular. I also desperately wanted the study to know that the study would give indications for more work that needed to be done in preparing migrants by the countries from which they move, and guidelines for those in the helping professions in the receiving countries. It may be that the migration from the Caribbean to Britain, to parents in Britain, may be on the wane, may be declining at present. But immigration is an ongoing process in several countries. Internally, from urban to rural, and externally from country to country in the area. And now that modern means of travel have made the world a neighborhood, when one source of promise of a better life proves to be unyielding and another source will be sought. I also hoped that the information which I was able to gather might be useful in the planning of community-based mental health programs, for it seemed that the average person was still lamentably unaware of the basic concepts of the psychosocial development of the human being, and that emotional first aid was not given to those struggling with stressful situations in their lives. I envisaged that there were difficulties and limitations to a study such as this, since the recalling of past feelings might have proved difficult for mothers. A retrospective view might not have coincided exactly with those held initially, and mothers who felt very guilty or ashamed about the separation experience might have allowed those feelings to influence their reaction in the interview to such an extent that they might have been tempted to reply with the answers which they imagined were expected. I was aware that the processes of remembering and forgetting involve considerable distortion from the original event and experience. And certain events are dropped from view. Others are elevated to prominence. And the entire past is recalled in a way which makes it more plausible and consistent in terms of the present experience. This is a quotation from Interviewing in the Handbook of Social Psychology, Volume 2. Yet I was hopeful that a sufficiently large number of mothers would cooperate and be objective enough to make the study worthwhile. The economic situation of the Caribbean islands was characterized by a high level of unemployment, which conditions gave rise to migration internally. I think I've said that before, and externally. But some migrants went to North and South America, Panama, Cuba, and others volunteered for the armed forces in Great Britain, while still others gained employment in factories and as technicians in the war industry. They worked in the war. Many of you will remember, heard of the Second World War. And when they returned to the Caribbean, when they were demobbed, ex-servicemen were unable to find employment. And potential immigrants, encouraged by reports of job opportunities and of the financial success of their friends and relatives in Britain, they came back to join them. And so a billowing mass of migrants flowed into Britain in between the years 1948 and 1959. Besides, the United States of America, they had passed the McCarran Act of 1952. That meant that act had closed, by that act, America had closed its doors to mass immigration of Black people from the West Indies. And so, this door being closed, the Caribbean people, they came through the open door of the mother country. The flow of immigrants was encouraged not only on recommendations from fellow workers, but in the case of many people from Barbados, recruitment of labor was made directly by the London Transport Executive, British hotels, and restaurant associations with the Barbadian Immigrants Liaison Service. At that time, there was that. One sociologist argues, sociologist called Seri Peach argues, that adverse conditions of the West Indian territories were permissive and not dynamic. They allowed migration to take place and did not cause it. And he pointed out that the migration rose and fell according to the demand for labor in Britain from year to year. And another sociologist speaks of the push and pull factors of immigration, admitting that the push factors of overpopulation, employment, low wage levels, lack of economic diversity, opportunity, or incentives were in existence for over half a century before, and served to send West Indian migrants in search of temporary and permanent employment to other countries. She concedes that the major pull factor stimulated migration to Britain was the fact of full employment in a diversified and large-scale economy. This full employment resulted in a flight from the less attractive and less well-paid jobs by British workers and a consequent shortage of labor. Another factor which was instrumental in causing an influx of migrants was the introduction of the Commonwealth Migrations Act of 1962. This helped to make many of the migrants believe that their stay was temporary when they arrived. Therefore, they did not make any attempt at having their families join them. But gradually, as the years went by, excuse me, the vision of their return home faded, and the possibility became very remote. Politicians were agitating for control and repatriation of migrants. And this seemed to galvanize them into action. And they decided that they would try and beat the band, as it would call, as it was called, and to ensure that their family and friends joined them in Britain. So therefore, the effect of the Commonwealth Migrant Act 1948 was not only to increase the number of immigrants in this country, including their dependents, who followed much later, but to increase the rate of arrivals to such an extent that in 18 months, the net inflow was almost as great as that of the previous 5 years. From the beginning of the migration, there was a high proportion of women, but the most popular pattern which evolved was that the men preceded their women in order to secure employment and to seek housing before inviting the women to join them. When they arrived with one or more children, but more frequently alone, they thought that working with their husbands would be able to amass more money together, and their stay would be so much shorter. So for those who intended to have their children join them, there was a similar reasoning that with both parents working together, they would in a shorter time be able to make the necessary arrangements, chief of which was obtaining suitable housing in order that the family would be reunited. And there is a statistic here that says that during the peak period of the immigration, which was 1953 to 1956, 162,000 of 162,000, 52 were women, I beg your pardon, 52 were men, 40 were women, percent were women, and only 8% children. So there were 52% men, 40% women, and 8% children. Those adults who left the islands between 1955 and 1960, they took 6,500 of their offspring, but left 90,000 children behind. The vast majority of the migrants were from those of the working classes of the various islands, and mostly from African origin. Many were skilled or semi-skilled. A minority were non-manual and included clerical workers, teachers, and nurses. As the immigration progressed, there was a steady increase in the number of rural farm workers. The family structure of the immigrants. Many of the women had a history of working and being the financial supporters of their children. The history of slavery indicated that the nuclear family pattern had not been encouraged by the slave masters. It is alleged that the slave owners used the male slaves for breeding in similar fashion as they did their stock. And the bearing of responsibility by a father could only be regarded as a distraction. The slave woman, she was first a full-time worker for her slave owner and only incidentally a mother. The children were the property of the slave master and they were delegated to the older women. But the enjoyment of childhood was of short duration. On some estates, the younger children from 6 to 12 years of age were formed in the second gang and set up to weed the crops, less for the sake of the work which they performed, but than for the habits of industry which it was hoped they would acquire. When occasionally a man was able to provide food for his family from the land that he was permitted to cultivate, this was dependent on the goodwill of the master, and therefore he could not regard himself nor be regarded by his family as the provider. It must be borne in mind that some slaves were elevated to positions of responsibility, such as headmen, and they continued polygamous mating patterns, so that when they were able to afford 2 or more wives, their children would therefore not be regarded as illegitimate. But although monogamy became the accepted pattern of life in the West Indies, many children are born outside of the matrimonial home and are therefore regarded as illegitimate. Brathwaite, Trinidadian sociologist, he disagrees with the anthropologist who says that legitimacy or illegitimacy makes no difference. He believes that the legal system reflected the basic predominant will of the particular society. Therefore, the discrepancy between illegitimate and illegitimate, while it may not be sociologically significant, represents a very real cleavage in the community. Illegitimacy may also pose problems in relations to children born to either one or the other parent who subsequently marries the other. As the nuclear family patterns become more the accepted norm, the child born prior to the parents' marriage may prove to be an embarrassment or even a bone of contention in the household. It would therefore seem that illegitimacy in the West Indies arose out of a blend of the heritage of Africa and the following conditions of slavery. Among the slaves taken from Africa, we are told that only 1/3 of them were women. When they arrived in the new country, the discrepancy in numbers between men and women became more acute, with the head man claiming 2 to 4 wives. And among the European population, there was also a shortage of women. And the men from the ruling classes were in the position to demand the services of the women of their choice from among the slaves. Another important fact to be borne in mind as influenced the incidence of illegitimacy is the young man's attachment to his mother. Sociologists such as Smith and Edith Clark, many of you may have come across her book when she said, "A Child Impressions." her son in her book of My Mother Who Fathered Me. She says in this book that it is a duty. The mother impresses her son that it is their duty to make up to her for the hardship she endured as the sole principal support of her children. This devotion to the mother is widespread throughout the islands and can at times be detrimental towards the formation of stable relationships between young couples. But this phenomenon is by no means peculiar to West Indians, for in other cultures, mothers-in-law are known to view their sons' wives with marriage hostility. And here in among younger Caribbean people who have adopted many of the cultural practices of the indigenous population, they also have these problems. Patterns of childcare would seem that among the working class West Indian, the heritage of Africa and the conditions of slavery blended together. The West, there is a possibility that the African West Indian harbored the memory, the West Indies harbored the memory of their African heritage and followed the example of their European mistresses who gave their children to be nurtured by nannies when very often sent them away to school in Europe. And I've noticed here that some people do just that. Because they're encouraged to work, they go out to work and leave their children to be looked after by, they call them nannies. And now some of them feel that sending children to boarding schools gives them a high status. Yes. This, and then we come to kinship care, kinship roles in working class families. Kinship. Very often, families who may bring children for adoption, and more families are giving children up for adoption, have requested that the children be given to some of their kin and relatives, because they believe that there will be the opportunity for continuity rather than to a strange foster carer. History tells us that in spite of opposition to the conversion of Christianity, the missionaries then, they penetrated into the barracks and converted to the Christian way of life. They aspired towards Christian marriage. And as their economic situation improved and there was the possibility for transmission of property for children, the custom of establishing monogamous units through legal marriage became more common.
Yeah. Elaine, we need to wrap up in 1 minute.
Yes, I was wondering. So the expectation of migration was that their presence in England would enable their children to obtain the education which they had been denied. And they saw opportunities for the children to enter institutions of higher learning, and so would have the opportunity to enter the professions, thus breaking the circle of poverty and low status. And we have seen that this has happened, that many of the children of the first and second generation are professionals, and they hold positions of authority in councils and they become politicians and so on. So wrapping up, this then is a brief look at the background of the people in the study. They came from the several islands and mainland territories in the Caribbean, Jamaica being responsible for 60% of the total number. There were a mixture of those with skills and those without, from the rural areas. But they were all filled with the desire to work, and many with the hope of amassing enough wealth to return home and invest this in businesses or farms or real estate. And many with the hope of seeing their children enter the established profession. It is true that a wide spectrum of beliefs and customs, accents, variants of speech exist in the various countries, giving each place and its inhabitants a distinctive character. But the bulk of the population which migrated share many characteristics, and they present many similarities in their practices. Among these common practices are to be found those of child rearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elaine, for such a broad and comprehensive analysis of the landscape. I now will call on Dr. St. Bernard. Dr. St. Bernard to respond. Dr. St. Bernard, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And it gives me great pleasure to just make a few comments with respect to the presentation by Dr. Elaine Arnold, whom we, the members of the RCYP group of researchers, and Salisis, and by extension, the UWI, the TMU, we have been very pleased to have Dr. Arnold be the honoree in this conference. And we are pleased to have witnessed her lecture related to her life's work and some of her insights with respect to her journey as a social worker, dealing specifically with that group of migrants who I would imagine would have been part of that Windrush generation. So we are very happy to have received her thoughts and ideas and insights on this matter. And I dare say they resonate quite well with the main themes of the RCYP's work, especially the theme that relates to immigration dynamics. In the context of the RCYP, we have been concerned largely with immigration dynamics and how those immigration dynamics hinder and as well as impact positively the rights and well-being of children, whether those children are children from the Caribbean, Central America, or even those who are part of the Caribbean and Central American diaspora in Canada. Of course, Dr. Arnold's work take us back 50 years, basically, to similar experiences that would have transpired in the context of the migration of Caribbean peoples to the United Kingdom, and especially that connection between mother and child and all of the ills that may have confronted both mother, child, and other family familial arrangements as a result of that immigration move by mothers, so to speak, and the whole question of reunification and how that reunification manifested itself, bearing in mind other familial dynamics. So by and large, what she has opened up is the importance of, these outcomes in the context of social work and what it may mean in terms of how various stakeholders stand to be the beneficiaries of the inputs that would be derived from the efforts and the professional work in particular of social workers as they apply their trade. I must say it was also a very intriguing discourse that demonstrated, intersectionalities in so many ways, because there was rich history, sociology, demography, anthropology, social work, economics, and the list goes on in terms of how they come together to help us to understand the kind of dynamics that we had to deal with as far back as the 1950s, 1960s. Of course, back then we were talking about emigration from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom, largely due to the forces that motivated those who were part of the Windrush generation to make that move. But with the Commonwealth Immigration Act in 1962, what you found was that there was a diminishing number of immigrants moving to England and the UK from the Caribbean, and more there were immigrants opting to go to the United States and Canada. And I think, what we are talking about here today in terms of much of the research that is presented, although we have opened it up and really spread the focus to ensure that we have a richer and more engaging discourse that treat with, the interconnections between the migration currents that come out in the work that we do and how such currents interact with so many of the other themes, whether we are talking about child protection, justice systems, education systems, how communications technologies are used, and in particular social media. I think all of this comes together in a delicate way. So I want to express on behalf of Salisis, on behalf of the TMU, on behalf of the RCYP group, and on behalf of all those who have witnessed your presentation today, Dr. Arnold, I want to express our sincerest thanks to you for having graced us with your presence, having shared your life's passion and your worldly knowledge with us. And we want to wish you God's blessings as you go forth and continue doing the wonderful work that you started some 60 plus years ago. So thank you very much. And we have been extremely delighted to have you among us and to deliver the great work that you have done and will continue to do. So thank you very much.
And in
Thank you very
closing, may I wish Dr. Arnold a happy 95th birthday, which comes up next month, in the month of November. So happy 95th birthday in advance.
Happy 95th, Dr. Arnold.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.